The announcement hit the wires like a thunderclap. In Tel Aviv, standing tall behind a podium wrapped in the colors of the Israeli flag, Benjamin Netanyahu's voice boomed across the airwaves. I am announcing my candidacy for Prime Minister once again. Israel needs strength, and I am that strength. Cameras flashed. His supporters cheered, but the words were not met with celebration everywhere. Thousands of kilometers away, in the heart of West Africa, a very different voice stirred. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing before a crowd in Ouagadougou, leaned into the microphone without a script or teleprompter. His tone was calm, but sharp enough to slice steel. The people won't elect a murderer twice, he said. The crowd fell silent at first. Then, it erupted. This wasn't just politics. This was war by words, swords drawn across continents. The kind of statement that echoed through foreign ministries, stirred journalists out of bed, and made leaders squirm in their seats. Because Traoré wasn't playing diplomat, he was sounding an alarm, and people were listening. Back in Israel, Netanyahu had barely returned backstage when reporters began bombarding his team with questions. What do you say to Traoré's comment? How do you respond to being called a murderer? The official response was quick, but cold. A spokesperson brushed it off as emotional rhetoric from a radical populist. But the internet didn't agree. Within hours, the video of Traoré's words spread like wildfire across social platforms. The clip, translated into a dozen languages, surged through timelines, spliced into TikToks, and headlined independent outlets across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. A murderer once is a mistake. A murderer twice is a nation's shame. That was the quote now carved into the digital consciousness. And it struck a nerve. Because behind Traoré's words were images the world had not yet forgotten, crumbled buildings in Gaza, children carried through smoke, mothers screaming beneath rubble. Traoré wasn't just giving a speech, he was putting a mirror in Netanyahu's face. And for the first time in years, someone was speaking not with diplomatic caution, but with raw, unfiltered truth. In an age of doublespeak, Traoré chose confrontation. Because silence, he believed, was complicity. And he had no intention of being silent. The shockwaves of Traoré's words reached Jerusalem before the sun had even risen. Inside the Israeli Prime Minister's residence, Netanyahu stood before a wall of advisors, arms crossed, face tight. He had expected pushback from Arab nations, perhaps even the UN, but not this. Not from him. Not from a 36-year-old African captain who had never bowed to Western pressure. He crossed a line, Netanyahu growled. An advisor spoke up. Sir, it's trending globally. His speech has been dubbed in French, Arabic, Portuguese. I don't care how many languages they scream it in, Netanyahu snapped. This is war. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Traoré remained unfazed. In Burkina Faso's presidential compound, modest, unpolished, with maps and resistance slogans pinned to its walls, he sat at a wooden desk reviewing footage from Gaza. His eyes didn't blink, his jaw didn't move, the images didn't surprise him, but they enraged him anew. His aide, a tall young man in fatigues, entered. They're calling for a formal retraction. Western envoys are pressuring us to soften your statement. Traoré looked up slowly, then let them feel pressure back. He stood and walked outside to the growing crowd. Journalists had gathered, the people, too. They were waiting for more. Traoré didn't hesitate. He stepped to the mic, lifted one photo high, a bloodied child pulled from debris, and spoke. This is not politics. This is not a campaign slogan. This is the truth you tried to bury. Cameras clicked. Gasps echoed. His voice deepened. You speak of peace while dropping bombs. You smile for cameras while mothers bury their babies. And you think silence protects you? He pointed at the cameras. This is Africa. We remember silence. We remember how it kills. I will not be quiet. I will not forget, and I will not let you lie. At that moment, something shifted. Traoré wasn't just challenging a man, he was challenging an empire of narratives. Of spin. Of PR machines that made war look like justice and death look like defense. And the world saw it. From Cape Town to Cairo, from Paris to Sao Paulo, from New York to Damascus, the image of Traoré holding that photo became a symbol. His voice, clear, uncompromising, became a line in the sand. The story wasn't just about Gaza anymore. It was about who dared to speak when speaking could cost you everything. And Traoré, he was all in. The world didn't just watch Traoré, they followed him. Within hours, major media outlets scrambled to reframe the confrontation. CNN called it an unorthodox diplomatic exchange. The BBC labeled Traoré's tone confrontational. Fox News accused him of radical grandstanding. But none of that mattered on the streets. In Dakar, murals of Traoré went up overnight, his fist raised, the bloody photo still in hand. In Rio, activists marched with signs reading, "Africa will not be silent." In Chicago, a protester painted on cardboard, "One voice against the lie." Traoré had become more than a president. He had become a rupture. Back in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu doubled down. Cameras caught him pacing a military command room, barking orders. Increase operations in Rafah. We send a message, not just to Gaza, but to every leader who thinks they can lecture Israel on morality. His generals nodded, but there was unease in their silence. They knew what Traoré had triggered wasn't military, it was moral. A moral earthquake. In the UN, where this all began, delegates whispered in elevators and corridors. Did you hear what Traoré said? He called Netanyahu a murderer, to his face. No one's ever done that, not like this. And yet, Traoré remained calm. He returned to Burkina Faso not to rest, but to prepare. His advisors suggested security upgrades. His generals offered to mobilize elite units. But Traoré shook his head. My defense is truth. My weapon is voice. If they fear words, they've already lost. Then came the leak. A whistleblower from an EU diplomatic meeting sent a transcript. Western leaders were plotting to isolate Traoré, economic sanctions, media smear campaigns, even intelligence operations. But the leak backfired. Now the world knew he was being punished for telling the truth. Support swelled. Latin American leaders quietly voiced admiration. African presidents, once cautious, now called for emergency summits. Arab youth shared Traoré's speech like wildfire, dubbing him, the brother we never had. And Netanyahu? He appeared on national television, jaw clenched, voice cold. This man has declared ideological war on Israel, he said. And wars have consequences. But Traoré had one final card to play, and he played it not with weapons, but with witnesses. He called for a people's tribunal, to be held in Ouagadougou. Survivors from Gaza. Former IDF soldiers. Journalists. Medical workers. If they will not listen in the halls of power, let the world hear the testimonies in the streets, he said. And the world leaned in. The announcement of the People's Tribunal spread like wildfire. Within days, thousands pledged to attend, academics, survivors, human rights lawyers, even defectors from Western intelligence agencies. Major cities began streaming solidarity events. The phrase, Ouagadougou will judge the world, became a global chant. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's government panicked. Shut it down, he barked during a high-level security meeting. Call Macron. Pressure ECOWAS. Freeze aid to Burkina Faso if necessary. But the tide had shifted. Even Macron, once a reliable ally, reportedly responded, "You lit the match." Now the fire spreads. Traoré, in contrast, prepared in silence. He visited a war hospital in Bobo Dioulasso. He knelt beside children with missing limbs, wiped the brow of a weeping mother, and said only, "The world will know your names." He did not pose for the cameras. He did not give speeches. But every lens captured him. On the day of the tribunal, thousands gathered in a circular open-air plaza in Ouagadougou. There were no grand stages. Just wooden benches, a modest podium, and a global live stream. The first to testify was a Gazan paramedic. She spoke of tending to children whose bodies arrived in pieces. Her voice didn't crack, it roared. The second, a Jewish journalist from Haaretz, confessed that his paper had buried dozens of war crime reports under government pressure. Then came a former IDF drone operator. He wept. We were told we were striking weapons. But I saw stuffed animals in the rubble. The world stopped scrolling. For once, the algorithm could not look away. At the back of the crowd, Traoré stood without guards. A breeze tugged at his collar. Dust swirled. He looked older, not in weakness, but in weight. The kind of weight that makes a man immovable. The tribunal trended higher than any G7 press conference that week. Netanyahu's press secretary called it a circus of fiction. But even his allies whispered doubts. Inside the Israeli Knesset, dissent grew louder. One opposition member tweeted, "If Netanyahu had the truth, he wouldn't fear testimonies. He'd welcome them." But perhaps the most explosive moment came unplanned. As a Palestinian boy took the stand, barely 11, he clutched a drawing, his family home, flattened. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He looked straight into the camera and said, "I used to dream of being an astronaut. Now I dream of waking up." The plaza went silent. And then, applause, not from Traoré, but from the people. An eruption of grief and fury, of love and revolt. Traoré walked forward. He did not speak. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. And the world understood. This was no longer about one nation. It was about justice denied, and now, demanded. The tribunal's shockwaves hit Tel Aviv like an earthquake. That night, tens of thousands flooded Rabin Square. Not for Netanyahu. Against him. Protest signs read, "Not in our name. War crimes are not security." Traoré spoke. We heard. Israeli media scrambled. Some anchors broke script mid-broadcast to acknowledge what they had seen. One, eyes trembling, said, "We mocked Traoré. We called him a puppet. But he just gave voice to our ghosts." In Washington, pressure mounted. Protests erupted outside the White House. Young activists chanted Traoré's speech word for word. In London, Trafalgar Square became a sea of red-stained flags and cardboard coffins. Netanyahu held an emergency press conference. With eyes sunken and voice brittle, he snapped. "This tribunal is illegitimate. Burkina Faso is a failed state run by a dictator." A reporter shouted back, "Then why are they doing what the ICC won't?" He froze. Then walked off stage. Meanwhile, Traoré did not gloat. He returned to his modest office, sat beneath a faded map of Africa, and drafted a letter to the United Nations Security Council. The language was sharp, unwavering. "If justice institutions will not act, we will. If you fear truth, then no, we fear silence more." The letter included documented testimonies, satellite images, and a demand. Recognize the Ouagadougou Tribunal under international law. The world split. Some called it a brilliant act of defiance, a masterstroke of moral diplomacy. Others accused Traoré of destabilizing the global order. But in African capitals, from Dakar to Nairobi, murals appeared overnight. One in Kinshasa showed Netanyahu's face cracking like stone under Traoré's hammer. Another in Lagos simply read, "He said what no one dared." Inside Israel, Netanyahu's political allies began to fracture. The far-right blamed him for underestimating Traoré. The centrists begged for de-escalation. And then, came the leak. A whistleblower released a classified recording, Netanyahu in a closed-door meeting, months prior, saying, "As long as we bomb quietly, no one will care. Especially not the Africans." The backlash was instant. #bomb quietly trended globally, not as defense, but as damnation. That night, a mural appeared in Gaza. It showed Traoré holding scales of justice in one hand, and in the other, Netanyahu's quote, burning. And on the streets of Ouagadougou, children recited the names of Gaza's dead. This was no longer politics. It was reckoning. The announcement of Netanyahu's candidacy had unleashed a flood of reactions across the globe. Western leaders offered their expected endorsements. News channels painted him as a symbol of Israeli resilience. But in the global south, and in every African capital where scars from colonial betrayal still bled, there was one question: would the world really allow this man to return to power? Traoré wasn't silent. But for a moment, the world was. He stood in front of the African Union headquarters, flanked by elders, scholars, and survivors of occupations, Palestinian and African alike. Behind him, a mural had been unfurled, a crying child in Gaza's rubble, holding a broken olive branch. Cameras buzzed. The press held their breath. "I will not speak as a politician today," he began, his voice lower than usual, sharpened with restraint. "I will speak as a witness. I have walked in Rafah. I have spoken to mothers who cannot bury their children because the drones do not sleep. I have seen what this man's leadership creates. And I say again, never again must mean something." His eyes scanned the crowd. Netanyahu is not a candidate. He is a crime scene. A few gasps escaped. The statement was more than a condemnation, it was an indictment. And he wasn't finished. He says he will protect his people. But who protects the world from him? Who protects peace from predators who wear suits and smile at cameras? He thinks power is given. No. Power is tolerated. And I promise you, Africa will not tolerate murder disguised as democracy. Reporters erupted. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag not again, hashtag Traoré speaks, and hashtag Gaza is watching trended within minutes. Some Western commentators tried to spin his words as reckless. But that failed. Because this time, he wasn't alone. Leaders from Mali, Algeria, South Africa, Brazil, and even unexpected voices from Europe echoed his warning. A new coalition was forming, not just against Netanyahu, but against every empire cloaked in the illusion of justice. That day, Traoré didn't just draw a line. He buried a flag in the sand. And dared anyone to step across it. When Traoré's speech echoed across continents, a political storm gathered with the weight of history. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's team scrambled to control the damage. In Washington, diplomatic phones lit up like wildfire. And in Paris, journalists whispered what others feared to say out loud: is the West losing its grip on the narrative? But in Ouagadougou, Traoré was calm. Focused. He sat beneath a baobab tree in a closed-door strategy meeting with regional leaders. Maps of Gaza, Israel, and key pressure points were spread across the table. But this wasn't a war council, it was a justice council. "There will be no bullets fired from us," Traoré said. "Only truth. But the truth will burn louder than bombs." Outside, a massive crowd had gathered. Not in protest, but in unity. Screens displayed footage of Netanyahu's campaign, juxtaposed with shattered hospitals in Gaza and white phosphorus raining down on children. The people had seen enough. Then something unexpected happened. An Israeli whistleblower, anonymous, disguised, but brave, leaked military footage confirming civilian targets were intentionally struck. The video showed laughter in command rooms, high fives after hits. It shattered any remaining illusion. The footage was aired first, on Traoré's media platform. The world didn't blink. It roared. At the UN, Traoré returned, not with accusation, but with evidence. He handed over the documents to the Secretary-General. "I do not seek punishment," he said. "I seek prevention. This man cannot lead again, not after this." silence followed. Netanyahu's camp, caught off guard, issued a vague denial. But it was too late. The mask had cracked. The silence of the international community was no longer interpreted as neutrality, it was seen as complicity. And then came the chant, from the streets of Dakar to the slums of São Paulo. Not again. Not this time. Traoré had not just confronted Netanyahu. He had exposed him. The leak had detonated like a truth bomb. Global headlines erupted. Netanyahu exposed in civilian strike cover-up, whistleblower footage confirms war crimes, Traoré's evidence forces UN emergency session. Every major broadcaster, from Al Jazeera to BBC, even hesitant Western outlets like CNN, ran segments they'd once buried. But the most viral clip wasn't from the media. It was a street interview in Nairobi. Traoré didn't just speak for Africa, the woman said. He spoke for the voiceless. For every child buried under rubble. For every mother who never got to scream. Netanyahu, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors flew, hospitalization, private jets, bunker meetings. But Traoré stayed visible. He toured universities, spoke to youth, held press conferences. Not once did he mention revenge. Instead, he asked one question again and again. If this man returns to power, what does that say about us? The UN reopened debate on sanctions. The ICC quietly began gathering documents. Allies that once stood firm behind Israel began issuing concerned statements. Even the United States, long shield for Netanyahu, paused. But it was a U.S. high school protest that broke the internet. Thousands of teenagers walked out of class with posters reading, "Traoré showed us. Now we show up." Meanwhile, Netanyahu tried to rally support. In a broadcast from a secured location, he declared, "I will not be silenced by smear campaigns. I will defend Israel with every fiber of my being." But the camera angle revealed more than intended. His hands trembled. His voice cracked. Even his eyes darted to the side, like a man haunted by the truth finally unleashed. Traoré watched that clip. Then turned to his advisor and said calmly, "The world sees him now." There was no victory speech. No boast. Just quiet clarity. Because this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about justice. And justice had a face now, firm, fearless, and African. The world had changed. Not in an explosive instant, but in a quiet, collective shift, an awakening. Traoré's confrontation, the evidence, the silence of Netanyahu in its aftermath, each moment had become a spark. Together, they ignited a fire no regime, no PR campaign, no drone strike could extinguish. In Ghana, schoolchildren recited Traoré's speech in class. In Paris, thousands marched wearing keffiyehs and Kent cloth side by side. In Chicago, murals appeared overnight, one showing Traoré standing before a cracked Israeli flag, not in triumph, but in truth. The movement had transcended Traoré himself. He was no longer just a leader of Burkina Faso. He had become a symbol, of defiance, of dignity, of a new global narrative where Africa did not whisper but roared. Netanyahu's team tried to regain control. They launched press campaigns, accused Traoré of incitement, labeled the whistleblower a traitor. But none of it stuck. Every attempt only fed the fire. The more they spoke, the more the world remembered the footage, the screams, the rubble. Then came the moment no one expected. The United Kingdom issued a formal statement urging Israel to delay the election. Germany paused weapons exports. The United States, still cautious, requested an internal review. And in Jerusalem, something cracked. A crowd gathered, not of support, but resistance. Israelis, too, had seen the footage. Mothers of soldiers. Former IDF members. Survivors of past wars. They held up signs reading, "Not in our name. You've lied enough, Bibi. Listen to Traoré." That last one echoed across continents. Traoré, meanwhile, addressed the African Union in Addis Ababa. No fist-pounding. No dramatic theatrics. Just one line that echoed louder than missiles. "The world is watching us now. Let's give them something worth seeing." The hall erupted in applause, not just for the man, but for what he represented, an Africa unafraid to challenge empires. And a world finally ready to listen. The election day arrived in Israel. But it didn't unfold the way Netanyahu had scripted. Yes, the ballot boxes were delivered. Yes, the news cameras were positioned. But outside, thousands surrounded polling stations, not just Palestinians or left-wing Israelis. This time, it was everyone tired of war. Grandmothers. Orthodox Jews. Young tech workers. Even retired generals. The streets rang not with slogans, but with silence, an act of collective refusal. They did not vote. Not out of apathy, but protest. Netanyahu's face flickered across screens as he cast his vote under tight security, smiling a politician's smile. But behind the scenes, his advisors panicked. Turnout was the lowest in modern Israeli history. The people had not chosen a new leader, but had refused to re-elect the old one. And in a symbolic twist, just as Netanyahu left the voting booth, global headlines hit. Traoré nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. The same man he'd mocked. The same voice he'd tried to silence. A journalist from Al Jazeera asked Netanyahu about the nomination. He dismissed it, called it a joke. Hours later, the final blow landed. A leaked recording from inside the Likud party revealed Netanyahu screaming at his cabinet. "Africa is laughing at us. He did this." One soldier with words, Traoré. And yes, Africa was watching. But it wasn't laughter they offered. It was solidarity. In Ouagadougou, fireworks lit the night sky. In Kigali, people danced. In Lagos, massive screens replayed Traoré's speeches like a championship match. He appeared again at the UN, not to gloat, but to close the chapter. His final words weren't aimed at Netanyahu. They were for the world. This was never about one man's fall. It was about a new beginning. Africa will not be silent again. The delegates stood. Even the ones who once looked away. Even the ones who once called him dangerous. And in that hall, so long frozen by fear and politics, a new anthem had begun. One built not on empire, but on reckoning. Not on bombs, but truth. And it carried Traoré's voice, like thunder, into history.